Welcome to True Crime Cases. In the tiny Illinois hamlet of Freeport, Michael, a young woman, was getting ready for what ought to have been the most joyous, the day she was born. And Michael was renowned in 1972 for her kind environment and her passion for assisting people. She was raised in a caring household. Her father and mother are both nurses. Michael's acquaintances who worked in factories characterized her as the type of someone who would make a special effort to make folks someone who believed in the good would grin. Michael met her fiance, who was kind to everyone. David was a charming man a few years ago. Years her senior, with an enigmatic history that he didn't often discuss. There was something about him at first. It drew Michael in. He was assured, always had the appropriate phrases to use, and possessed a commanding presence that made people listen. He had a difficult upbringing. Chicago neighborhood, and it was evident informed Michael that his childhood had been difficult, but she had faith in because below his tough exterior was a decent guy who had just made some incorrect decisions, in spite of some early worries from Michael's relatives who observed that David may be domineering. She occasionally stood up for him because she thought Michael believed that he had transformed her. After they were wed, things would calm down. He would abandon his. She saw her troublesome past behind her for good. She thought she could save him. Person who may assist him in becoming by 1996. She understood he wanted to be a man. Only 2 years after David's introduction, suggested Michael's relatives, but nonetheless reluctantly endorsed her choice after Michael appeared content overall, and that was all they've ever desired. June was chosen as the wedding date. 22nd, 1997, and Freeport as a whole was anticipating the momentous day that was to be a lovely event that takes place at the local church, with relatives and friends getting together to honor Michael and the union of David. But below, not everything was as ideal as David seems to have been hiding something from Michael, concealing aspects of his existence, things she was unaware of in spite of his pledges to abandon his previous behaviors. David had persisted in participating in illicit behavior, that he had already engaged in violence, and had participated in unlawful activities. Michael was utterly ignorant of anything. Beyond that, he continued to date a lady from his earlier. Michael had never heard of this person. As Michael's wedding day drew near, friends observed that she appeared feeling more nervous than normal. They choked it up to jitters before the wedding, were unaware that Michael had begun to question some things she had heard of the decisions she had taken. Rumors that David was involved with another lady, but each time she brought David would swiftly brush it off, telling her there was nothing to worry about. Approximately on the wedding morning, Elena, Michael's mother, assisted her in obtaining prepared. Viewing her kid, and Elena was unable to wear her white wedding dress. Dispel the sensation that something was, she had opposed the marriage, which was incorrect from the beginning, but Michael had been extremely resolved to do it right now. Observing her while standing in the cathedral, daughter getting ready for her wedding, Elena begged for her uncertainties to be erroneous. As the visitors packed, that there was a sense of enthusiasm at church. Everyone was excited to see it in the air. David and Michael exchanged vows. However, Michael was standing at the walking down the aisle. At the entrance, a sense of coldness swept over her. Couldn't describe it, but briefly she pushed, despite feeling frozen in place. Putting the emotion aside, and grinned as she started to go toward David's direction, who was awaiting at the altar. The ceremony went without a hitch. With everyone's attention on the pair, David appeared composed in his black suit, and nobody in the room could have anticipated the impending calamity. Once Michael arrived at the altar, she looked at David for a moment. The world appeared to halt for a time. The priest was prepared, and the guests were grinning, and the front seats were occupied by Michael's relatives. Proudly and emotionally seeing the row, she attempted to persuade herself that she was certain that everything would be okay. Adored David, and this marked the start. Despite their just-formed relationship, the priest started the ceremony, and the couple as they exchanged vows. David's voice was steadily, using well-chosen phrases. He talked of a future, love, and fidelity. As he put the ring on them, together, Michael grinned gently at her finger. Previous uncertainties dissipating in the warmer as soon as she trusted him, she felt optimistic about their future. But as the event came to a close, something David's expression changed, and it was subtle yet noticeable enough for Michael, his formerly serene and kind face turned into. Even the guests didn't notice the faraway cold. Observed that everything was going too fast. Michael was questioned by the priest if she gave David her hand in marriage. Before the words, but before the tongue to say "I do" may abruptly escape her lips, David abruptly retreated. David looked into his jacket to see what had transpired. Next happened so fast that nobody might respond quickly. In a violent motion, David produced a blade prior to Michael was able to recognize what was occurring. David stabbed the victim, and a horrified cry ripped across her chest. Across the chapel, while Michael passed out to the ground, gripping the wound, a white garment that rapidly becomes crimson with mayhem as the church exploded in blood. The air was filled with cries as visitors leaped to their feet and running in Michael's direction. However, it was also Alina, the mother of the late Michael, she knelt down to get to her kid first. Michael's hands shaking at her side as she applied pressure on the wound in an effort to halt the bleeding, but Michael's wide eyes showed that the hurt was too deep. Were astonished and perplexed, incapable of understanding what had just occurred because she had put her confidence in David. Alina adored him, but how could this be true? Screamed for assistance. David froze. The bleeding knife was briefly still in his hand. He made no attempt to assist Michael. Additionally, he showed no remorse for his icy gaze around the throng, as though he were not involved in the turmoil. He had simply because, without saying anything, he turned and ran away from the visitors in the church. Were stunned and immobilized by the terror that they had just seen. When no one moved, a few men entered. David was chased by the throng, but he had already vanished into the streets. Fear swept through the area outside the church. The audience, as they become aware of the David has just committed an unthinkable murder. Michael, the one he was meant to live the remainder of his days in front of their whole family and circle of acquaintances, as Michael was found dead on the ground of the church, encircled by those who loved her so much that nobody could did her eyes, and breathing become shallow, gradually losing concentration in her last moments. Michael must have been thinking, rushing to figure out why the guy she believed that the person had deceived her in such a horrific manner. In a matter of minutes, paramedics arrived, but Michael, it was too late. Perished with her life cut in her mother's arms. Brief on the day she was meant to, in order to start her future with David, the scene was one of unfathomable sorrow. Michael's mom was distraught about her. The now eerily quiet was filled with cries. Her father stood in church, his face frozen. The guests that had arrived were pale with astonishment. To commemorate a wedding were given a recollection that would follow them about forever. It was intended to be a day full of happiness, and love had become one. During the worst times, the town of Freeport have always heard about the tragic events swept through the town's residents. Found it difficult to comprehend what had occurred, how David, the one who had pledged to cherish and guard, why did Michael do something so unimaginable? Had he committed such a heinous thing in front of their acquaintances? But as investigators would shortly discover, the day's startling events were only the start of a sinister and twisted narrative. In the hours after the homicide, Freeport, the town, was in a condition of incredulity that anything could so terrible events have occurred in wide daytime, in a setting intended for love and unity. Local law enforcement right away started looking for David, but he had as if to disappear completely. The whole community was left feeling shook. Looking for solutions as the police inquiry went forward, started to reveal a more sinister aspect of the only life Michael had was David's. Glimpsed but never completely recognized that, on the surface, David seems to be a sweet and changed his background, however, offered a totally different tale. David had been raised in one of the most criminally active areas, where survival frequently required conformity to hazardous individuals with whom he came into contact. Criminal groups at an early age, beginning with minor offenses, before progressing to more grave transgressions. By the time he was early in his 20s, David had established a repute as a guy who was able to accomplish tasks, but also has a violent streak that held people at bay. In spite of the commitments he made to Michael, departed from this life. David never really actually fled his past throughout the months before his wedding. He had been covertly getting back in touch with old criminal associates, discovering themselves once more entangled in a network of unlawful action. But it extended beyond his connections to a crime that put his relationship at risk with Michael's. Investigators shortly learned that David had participated with Lisa, another lady, whom he long before he met Michael. He was aware Lisa, in contrast to Michael, was well aware of the evil side of David, and it appeared that she encouraged it in addition to accepting it. If the police found proof implying that David had never really broke up with Lisa in spite of his Michael's engagement, this affair, paired with his incapacity to shatter free of his criminal ties, produced a risky strain in David's life, one that would ultimately result in Michael's death. Investigators assembled the period. They started to think that David's choice to murder Michael wasn't an impulsive action of violence, but he had something prepared in the days before the wedding. His participation with Lisa and his journey back to he could have been motivated by a life of crime to consider Michael to be a barrier. Someone who was impeding his ability to live wished to win Michael's affection. Belief in him had become a burden. It ran counter to the more sinister course he had selected, but there was an additional component to David's disturbed state of mind. Investigators conducted additional interviews with some of David's former friends, indicated that he had started to show more unpredictable and hazardous conduct in the weeks leading up to the wedding. He had mentioned feeling imprisoned by wishing to go away from his obligations, and there were clues that he did not view Michael as a partner. Nevertheless, he had to get rid of the picture of the ideal wedding. Michael had a loving future. The imagined had been twisted in David's thoughts, become something scary, a trap that he had to get out of at any expense. In the meanwhile, Freeport Michael's family was shocked and in mourning, not just by her passing, but also by the ruthless, the way it had occurred to her. Elena, the mother, couldn't get the picture of her blood-stained daughter laying in her father battled with her wedding gown. To understand the loss of friends and family members came together to help them. However, nothing could make the trauma of what happened go away. Occurred in that church as the police inquiry deepened, concentrated on locating David. They looked about the nearby surroundings, erected obstacles, and spoke with anybody who may have spotted him following his escape from the church for days without any reliable leads, and it appeared David had disappeared into thin air. Although they were aware something David, a man, couldn't conceal, he has too many ties for eternity. Several connections to his criminal history that may ultimately result in his collapse at that moment, just when it seems that there had been no progress on the path. A passing truck driver gave a tip via a neighboring town, proposed that David was seen at a distant petrol station with a woman who matches when Lisa described it. The cops hurried to the place in the hopes that they were at last. The fugitive is getting closer, but as they would soon discover that David has no plans to go in silence. He didn't intend to being prosecuted for his actions against the manhunt was on its way to Michael. A fatal and perilous outcome as the police followed the truck's tip driver. They stepped up their investigation. At the distant petrol station, they quickly learned that Lisa and David had been seen at a derelict a few kilometers distant. Authorities at the motel right off the highway swiftly mobilized and ready to enclose on the spot where David was concealed. The cops had previously put the pieces together. David had been evading capture with Lisa ever since the wedding day. It turned into evidently Lisa had been more than simply as a spectator to this terrible incident. She had been assisting David in completely avoiding capture, conscious of his actions toward Michael. As investigators looked more closely at Lisa's, they discovered in the past that she had her own history of thievery, and it seemed that she had committed drug-related charges. Relationship with David was much more than they were companions in a casual relationship, both physically and symbolically in crime. Considering this new information legislation, enforcement was aware that they had to move quickly. David and Lisa were too important to jeopardize. The hotel was sliding away once more. In the early morning hours, surrounded by AM, and a tactical group arrived in to help the cops with the raid anticipated to apprehend David without any problems. However, they were ready for the worst. David was, after all, a guy with an aggressive history. and they were aware that he wouldn't reluctance to using force to as dawn dawned. The policemen made their getaway. They stormed the hotel as their move. Bursting through the room's door, what were David and Lisa concealing? Their greatest fears were validated by what they discovered within. Worries that David was prepared and armed to engage in a quick but fierce standoff happened after the cops told David to drop his weapon. But rather than giving it over, David aimed his firearm toward the cops, shooting many times in a desperate return of the effort to elude the police flames, and it was gone in a matter of seconds. During the exchange, David was shot and killed. The same horrific way his life ended, he had decided that Lisa, who had been by his side, was brought into detention without more opposition as the hotel room was cleared of dust. Hauntingly quiet, the last section of After David's life unfolded in tragic events, and a storm of bullets for the residents of Freeport were, at a David's sense of closure, is bittersweet. He would never be able to, after death, to cause harm to others once more, but for Michael's family, the man's victory was meaningless. The person who killed their daughter was no longer there. However, Michael was also unable to bring her back, and her loss's sorrow still had a significant impact on everyone who had encountered her in the days after. David's investigators of deaths kept on asking Lisa questions in an effort to comprehend her part in the activities preceding the murder of Michael. Under pressure, Lisa acknowledged that she had communicated with David during his engagement to Michael, was aware of the wedding. David had been having trouble with the notion of getting married to Michael, and she had urged him to end the relationship. But rather than just abandoning Michael, David had taken a far more sinister route, one Lisa said she didn't anticipate, despite her efforts to minimize her engagement. It was evident that detectives who believed Lisa had been participating in David's escape following she had expelled him from the murder. He was concealed by the church and hotels, and even provided him with cash and munitions to avoid being caught for her assistance. And Lisa was accused of aiding a fugitive and being given a sentence of many years in jail, even though she hadn't really took part in the murder of Michael. Her subsequent activities rendered her culpable of disclosing the individual in charge of as the case was coming to an end. The criminal, the town of Freeport, made an effort to move on. However, the remembrance of Michael's terrible passing, her family continued to struggle with the burden of their sorrow, clinging to the recollections of the kind and compassionate daughter. The wedding they had lost would be transformed into a nightmare. Regarded as one of the most depressing days in the history of the town, is the tale of the murder of Michael was a sobering reminder of the risks associated with lying below the exterior of even the finest building. Ideal partnerships, with her steadfast faith in David's virtue, had cost her despite the warning indications. Everything, even though justice had been served as a wound from losing her life. It would never completely recover for those who had cherished her following David's passing, as well as Lisa's detention in the town of Freeport, had to contend with the following: a catastrophe that had destroyed the sense of security. In the funeral of Michael in their tiny community took place a few weeks following the tragedy, attended by hundreds of individuals from everyone wants to pay in Freeport and beyond. Their admiration for the young lady, whose the church had been so overtaken by life. The exact location where Michael had visited was brimming with flowers, and the mood was one of profound sadness. Robert and Elena, their parents, were inconsolable, their sorrow quite as much hefty to carry, making it challenging for the town's residents to forget what had occurred in the church. And many people thought the picture of Michael wearing her wedding gown drenched with blood and resting on the floor stayed engraved in their memories. In the months after the catastrophe, the community came together to support Michael's in her honor. Family vigils were conducted, when neighbors and friends offered as much assistance as possible. But for Elena and Robert's life would change forever. Their only daughter's passing left Elena frequently felt a hole that nothing could fill. Discussed her feelings of remorse and how she had felt that there was a problem on the day of the wedding, but was unable to prevent. Robert, a quiet man, retreated inside himself, finding it difficult to talk about his beloved daughter so profoundly throughout time. The specifics of the results of the study kept coming to light. The fact that David had planned was confirmed. Long before Michael was killed, he had told Lisa that he felt confined by the notion of getting married, and had no want to begin a new life with Michael. The strain of having two lives, life one, who is presumed to be the spouse, and the other as a male participant in illegal, his level of activity had reached a breaking point. Instead of ignoring the relationship, David made the decision to Lisa's involvement in the crime was violent. Also carefully scrutinized, even though she had not carried out the murder in person. She had supported David's development. His animosity with Michael is causing him to becoming more paranoid and driving him into the cops have a destructive and gloomy outlook. Discovered letters and phone records between Lisa and David, demonstrating how she was intricately involved in the occurrences. Preceding the homicide, while Lisa denied being aware that David would murder Michael's wedding day, was filled with thought she had performed a far bigger function than she acknowledged in the years that followed Michael's narrative, and turned into an emblem of loss, as well as the perils of disregarding warning signs in her relationships. Domestic abuse was the subject of the case study. Legal professionals and advocates who pointing out the warning indicators that were missed David's domineering actions. His dark and criminal history connection with Lisa for a long time. The untimely passing of Michael was a reminder of the significance of identifying and dealing with hazardous conduct prior to it becoming into Alina and Robert. Something far worse ultimately laid a foundation, and Michael's name is committed to helping victims of abuse in the home and raising knowledge of the risks associated with dominating connections. They wish to be sure that no other household would have to put up with the suffering they experienced. Suffered the annual foundation event. Activities to pay tribute to Michael, establishing a location for victims of domestic abuse to tell their tales and obtain assistance despite the suffering of losing Michael would never completely go away. Her parents took some comfort in lending a hand. Alina in particular turned into an ardent supporter of early intervention, speaking at abusive relationships, community centers, and schools. Regarding the significance of identifying the symptoms of risk, her message was unmistakable. Love should never be harmed, and nobody should ever experience confined or terrified in partnership. Michael's tale is still devastating. Illustration of the speed with which a dream may into what should have been a nightmare. Her most joyful day has turned into a terrible catastrophe that nobody could have predicted. Her love and trust for David, in spite of the cautionary indicators, had eventually caused her premature death. Yet due to her parents' efforts and the dedication of the community to commemorating hope became the legacy of Michael. And safeguarding her story via prevention would be remembered, and that other might gain insight from the catastrophic repercussions of disregarding the warning indicators of unhealthy partnerships.